Become your favorite one-stop shop. Great sandwiches with boar's head meats, fresh salads, fresh coffee in many flavors, China Mist tea, and a large selection of cold beer and fine wine, including kosher wine from Europe, Israel, and the United States. Call for wine case price specials. Need gas? Use your Shell card for a 5% discount. Always clean and inviting, Maryland Deli and Mini Mart has everything you expect from a Mini Mart and much more. But don't take my word for it. Check it out for yourself. The northwest corner of 7th Street in Maryland, or give them a call at 602-277-6269. That's 602-277-6269. That's Maryland Deli and Mini Mart, 7th Street, Maryland, Phoenix. Located near several synagogues, water available for Sabbath walkers. Tell them William Wolf sent you there.
Start this year right with a well-trusted accounting firm here in the Valley, Nelson & Robles PC, certified public accountants in the Valley since 1977. Nelson & Robles PC specialize in monthly accounting and tax preparations for all types of businesses, as well as individuals, trusts, and estates. If you have an accounting or tax need, then call Nelson & Robles PC today at 602-944-4242. That's Nelson & Robles PC, a trusted Valley accounting firm since 1977. 602-944-4242. Call today.
Now on News Talk 960 KKNT, it's the Middle East Radio Forum. Your chance to talk about the turmoil in the Middle East. To call in live, dial anytime at 602-508-0960. That's 602-508-0960. Outside of the Valley, call toll-free 888-960-9696. Now your host for the Middle East Radio Forum, Attorney William J. Wolf.
Good afternoon. It's March 11, 2007. My name is William Wolf. I'm the host of Middle East Radio Forum. This show airs every Sunday at noon here in Phoenix. It's available worldwide on the internet on my website, middleeastradioforum.org. There's been a time change, at least in the United States, and now it's the same time on the West Coast. It'll be 2 p.m. Central Time, 3 p.m. Eastern Time. And I'm not sure what time in Israel, either 9 or 10, and I'll ask one of my guests to clarify that in a minute. But as you know, we always start with my random thoughts. This is just something that's near and dear to my heart, doing this show, and I'm just hoping it's important to all of my listeners. If you've listened more than once, I assume you agree with me. And again, how do you help the show succeed? Well, you support my advertisers, and when you do, you please tell them that you're doing it because they advertise on this program. And some people have very kindly sent me some direct support. They call it perhaps a voluntary subscription. Obviously, you don't have to send me anything, but if you'd like to help out, you can send me a check at 1121 East Missouri, Suite 117, Phoenix 85014. That's 1121 East Missouri, Suite 117, Phoenix 85014. I enjoy bringing the show to you. I hope you enjoy listening. And also, I would appreciate your emails. You can send me an email through my website, middleeastradioforum.org, where you can also listen to old shows in the archives. I think I have over 100 shows now in the archives, so you can listen to shows twice, or you can catch shows that perhaps you've missed before. Okay, let's go to my guest today. I have a special guest today from Israel, Professor Menachem Klein. Menachem Klein, are you there?
Yes, I am here in Jerusalem. Regards from Jerusalem to everybody. It's 4 minutes after 9 o'clock in the evening.
Okay, thank you. That means you have not gone on daylight time yet, I suppose.
No, not yet. It will be, I assume, before Pesach.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much. Let me give you a brief introduction. I pulled up your biography on the internet, and it would take the whole show, basically, to talk about all the things you've done, but basically, you're an author of many articles in journals, including the PLO and the Right of Return and the Middle East Peace Process. You've written several books in Hebrew and English, and you're a conference lecturer. And I will add that I met you a few weeks ago when you were giving a lecture at Arizona State University, and I asked you if you'd like to be on the show, and you kindly agreed, and I thank you very much for that. My other guest today is a guest who's been on the show several times before, author Devin Sper. Good afternoon, Devin.
Good afternoon, Bill, and good afternoon to you, Professor.
And Devin is an author of a book that I've read twice, and I think I'm actually in my third time because I find it so interesting and insightful. It's called The Future of Israel, and I advise people, if they're not familiar with it, to pick up a copy. And Devin, can you briefly tell people how they can get a copy?
Well, they can buy it locally at any of the Jewish stores, Scottsdale Kosher Market, the Jewish Connection, the Jewish Quarter, or they can buy it anywhere on www.thefutureofisrael.net.
Okay, thank you, Devin. Okay, this is going to be sort of a debate situation. I'm going to go back and forth between my guests. I'd ask both of my guests to please keep your responses fairly brief, approximately 60 seconds. I'm going to try not to cut anybody off, but if it goes on too long, I will exercise my prerogative as the show host to do so. And I would also ask my guests to please not speak over the other person. Too often on TV and radio, you get more than one person talking at the same time, which means that you can't understand anybody. Okay, also regarding calls, this is a call-in show. Local number 602-508-0960, toll-free 1-888-960-9696. For the purposes of today's show, however, I'm going to ask my listeners to please wait till the bottom of the hour to ask any questions. We'll take as many callers as we can, but only after the bottom of the hour, so we have our guests plenty of time that they can respond fully to the questions here. And Professor Klein, since you're my honored guest from Israel, I'm going to ask you the first question. Iranian President Ahmadinejad has repeatedly called for the destruction of Israel, a fellow member state of the United Nations. Do you believe Iran should be expelled from the United Nations for this direct violation of the UN Charter and Convention Against Genocide?
I do believe that the international community must take some tough measures and steps against Iran. But the question, in my view, sitting in Israel, is whether the Iranian threat, is it real? How real it is real? And is our situation here in Israel equivalent to 1939 or 33 when Hitler came to power? So I am less worried than some of the Israeli politicians. I do not think that we are back in time to 39, the year 39, and I'm quite sure that Israel can deal with the Iranian threat.
Okay, Devin Sper, go ahead, please.
Well, I do think that it's obvious that the Iranians are in violation of the UN Charter and the Convention Against Genocide. The whole purpose of the United Nations is to solve problems through negotiations among the members rather than their having to resort to war. If one member, like Iran, threatens annihilation against another member, the entire purpose of the United Nations is null and void. As to what the professor said about this being 1939, it's certainly 1933, in which, or equivalent to 1933, when Hitler was still weak. He marched into the Rhineland, broke the Versailles Treaty, and the world did nothing about it. And in doing nothing about it, of course, led to a much harsher situation later on.
Okay, let me follow up on this a little bit, Professor Klein. You said Israel could deal with it. What I'm worried about is, do you deal with it after there's an atomic explosion in Israel? To me, that's too late. And I'd just like to ask both of my guests to follow up on my question there. Professor Klein?
It's not too late. If you take the doctrines of nuclear weapons, each side knows that the other side has a second strike capability. So the Iranians are fully aware of the Israeli second strike capabilities. Israel has, according to the foreign media, nuclear submarines with missiles. The Iranians know very well that they can be hurt dramatically, very painfully by the Israeli nuclear capability. Olmert approved in German TV that Israel has a nuclear capability. So I'm not worried at all from this. I'm worried by the talking, but not by the deeds of the Iranians.
Okay.
I'm much less worried than my colleague.
Okay, Devin, go ahead, please.
Sorry, could you repeat the question one more time?
I was just asking, isn't it too late if Iran attacks Israel and there's an atomic explosion over Israel to respond? As far as I'm concerned, you can't wait to that point.
Yes, I agree. And in answer to what the professor has said, the assumption behind what he's saying is that Iran is led by irrational leadership. The problem is that Ahmadinejad and the whole Iranian leadership is a theocracy which has an apocalypse as part of its basic theology. They not only don't fear an apocalypse, they require it in order to bring back the Shia Ali, and therefore they are seeking an apocalypse. So what the professor said about deterrence would work with a rational, although hostile state like the Soviet Union. It will not work in the case of a madman like Ahmadinejad or Hitler.
Okay, Devin, let me ask you, what do you think should be done about Iran's open defiance of the International Atomic Energy Agency demands that Iran cease its nuclear program?
Ideally, there should be real sanctions placed on Iran. And I have said before in the show that I think sanctions could actually work in the case of Iran, because Iran is dependent on the outside world for absolutely everything, even refined oil. The proof that this is so is that the United Nations has not placed real sanctions on Iran. They've simply given them a slap on the wrist. And even this has resulted in great splits and problems within the government and the population of Iran. For example, just the other day, an Iranian general defected to the West. A week ago, Ahmadinejad was booed off the stage at a university in Tehran when he tried to speak. And this is all without real sanctions. Real sanctions and real economic sanctions would bring down the collapse of this regime without bloodshed, and that should be the objective. Those who resist putting real sanctions on Iran, those who, like the professor, say it's not really a problem, are going to be responsible later when it leads to bloodshed. Okay,
Professor Klein, your response?
I agree with one point of my colleague in the studio, that Iran enjoys a variety of opinions, that Iran is not one man's show, as I cannot say that United States is one man show of George W. Bush. Iran is not Ahmadinejad. There are many voices inside. The society is very active against the rule of radical Islam. There are many voices inside. There is a great opposition against the president and great criticism inside. And here, a very delicate acts should be taken by international community, because in external pressure, too much pressure from outside could be counterproductive. So the lesson from Iraq should be learned also in Iran.
Okay, Professor Klein, in light of what we've been talking about here, would you agree that Iran does pose an existential threat to Israel? And if you believe so, what do you believe should be done about it?
I do not believe that Iran is that Israel face any existential threat. Okay. Israel is very strong. Israel is very powerful. Israel is not going to be deleted from the map. Israel is not only strong by its military capabilities, but also as a society is a very well-based. I would like to send this message to all my colleagues, Jewish fellows all over the world, especially in the United States. Be less worried. Don't go after politicians for political purposes or for generals that they want to buy new toys and play with new arms or aircraft and so on. Israel is strong. It will exist. It exists already almost 60 years. It will exist forever. Don't be worried.
Okay, Devin?
Well, I have to disagree with you, Professor. A country led by a madman, which openly threatens to wipe Israel off the map and is in the process of obtaining nuclear weapons, is a real threat. And not to acknowledge that is to deny reality.
Okay, Devin, let me ask you, what do you think should be done about Iran and Syria's financing, training, and hosting of terrorist organizations like Hezbollah, Hamas, the PFLP, and Islamic Jihad?
Syria, too, is liable to sanctions and should be sanctioned, and that would have an effect on a country like Syria. It's a brutal dictatorship with little support among the people that we can discern. And there is no reason why, if we're seeking to avoid war and bloodshed, we shouldn't use the United Nations to put sanctions on these people. To avoid doing that is going to, in the long run, lead to bloodshed.
So just to follow up, so you believe the United Nations, at least in this theater of operation, can be effective?
Yes, there are cases where it can be and there are cases where it can't be. But I believe sanctions can work if they're real sanctions.
Okay, Professor Klein?
My interest as an Israeli is to have a peace agreement with Syria. There is a peace proposal coming from the Syrian regime. Israel refused because Israel likes the Golan Heights, the occupied Golan Heights, because the Americans refused letting Israel to negotiate. My interest is to go ahead to sign a peace agreement with the Syrian regime, and then the strategic base of Israel and will be much, much better than today.
Okay, we are coming up on the first break of the day. We have 3 breaks during the program. I'd ask my guests to please just wait for the commercials here. You're listening to Middle East Radio Forum here on News Talk 960 KKNT. My name is William Wolf. The show every Sunday, noon to 1 o'clock here in Arizona. It's available worldwide. We do have worldwide listeners on my website, middleeastradioforum.org, where you can also listen to old shows in the internet. And as I said in the opening, I do request your support both by patronizing my advertisers and by telling them that you're doing so because they advertise on this program. And if you'd like to send me a direct check, you can certainly do that at 1121 East Missouri, Suite 117, Phoenix, Arizona 85014. I look forward to having you back after the show, and we're going to, after the break here, we're going to be taking questions after the bottom of the hour. Please stay with us. We'll be right back with Professor Menachem Klein.
Anytime at 602-508-0960. That's 602-508-0960. Outside of the Valley, call toll-free 888-960-9696. Now back to your host, Attorney William J. Wolf.
Welcome back to today's edition of Middle East Radio Forum. My name is William Wolf. The show every Sunday, noon to 1 o'clock here in Arizona. Of course, adjust your time if you're listening elsewhere on my website, middleeastradioforum.org, where you can also send me emails, and you can listen to old shows in the archives. Have a very interesting show today. I have Professor Menachem Klein of Bar-Ilan University. He's in Jerusalem as we speak, and author Devin Klein is in studio today.
Devin Sper.
Excuse me. Devin Sper. Pardon me. I'm looking at the name Klein here. Yes, Devin, now let me ask you the next question. The United States and even Europe considers Hamas a terrorist organization. Do you agree?
Certainly. If we define terrorism as targeting of civilians, then that is precisely Hamas's modus operandi. They lob rockets on a daily basis into Israeli towns around Gaza, targeting civilians. They're not targeting military bases. And when they send a suicide bomber to blow up a bus or a supermarket or a nursery school, they're clearly also not targeting military. They're targeting civilians. So yes, Hamas is a terrorist organization.
Okay, Professor Klein?
Hamas uses terrorist methods alongside political means and tools. I would like to add something to the definition of a terrorist organization.
Go ahead.
Terrorist organization must have a political goal. Otherwise, it is like breaking into a house or breaking into a store and stealing and targeting civilians. Targeting civilians is a criminal act. It's not terrorist attack. Terrorist attack is attacking civilians in purpose in order to achieve a political goal. So by definition, any terrorist organization is also a political organization.
Well, I would still like you to answer the question directly. Do you consider Hamas to be a terrorist organization?
It is an organization that uses terror as part of a whole menu. Sometimes they use also guerrilla attacks against Israeli soldiers. So it's not only, but Hamas definitely use terror against Israeli civilians.
Okay. All right. Professor Klein, would you agree that targeting civilians is evil regardless of one's motives?
I am against targeting civilians. Exactly what you said. The motivation is much less important than the goal of targeting civilians, hurting in purpose civilians. Now, states also can use terror. It's not only a method used by organizations. As you said, targeting civilians in purpose in order to achieve a political goal. It can be done by organization. It can be done by a state. So regardless who is doing terrorist attacks, who is implementing terrorist attack, the target, that's the key element in defining a terrorist attack. So I agree with you.
Okay, excellent. Devin?
I agree with the professor. That's precisely the definition of terrorism, and I agree that the organization has to have a political goal, which certainly Hamas does.
Okay, let's move on then. Let me ask you, Devin, isn't Hamas's call for the destruction of Israel a violation of the United Nations Convention Against Genocide?
You could say that its call for the destruction of Israel is a violation of the United Nations Convention Against Genocide in spirit. What's a real actual violation is its acting on that call. In other words, unlike Ahmadinejad, the Hamas is not merely calling for the destruction of Israel. Hamas is actually trying to destroy Israel. They slaughter Israeli civilians. They murder Israelis all the time. And they conduct a campaign of terror, the likes of which the world has never seen. And that is certainly in violation of the campaign against genocide, because their declared goal is genocide against the Jews of Israel.
Okay, Professor Klein?
Hamas is a more complicated phenomena. Already 20 years passed since the foundation of Hamas, and Hamas recently changed. It has many voices inside, not only the voice of the Islamic Charter that we just heard. So there are also voices of agreeing to live next to Israel with a long-term, open-ended ceasefire once Israel withdraws to 67 borders and the Palestinian state established there and the refugees return to Israel. So we cannot say definitely that the ultimate goal of Hamas is just to destroy the state of Israel. So there are other voices inside, and there are proposals actually presented by Hamas leadership. These are less attractive to the Israelis, are not attractive and unacceptable to the vast majority of the Israelis, but we cannot say that Hamas is the same as the Islamic Charter.
Okay, let me ask you a follow-up on that. Do you believe that if Israel went back to the pre-Six-Day War borders, in other words, the 1949 armistice lines, that there would be peace?
What do you mean by peace? Do you mean that we will fall in love with the Arabs and they will eat gefilte fish and we will...
No, Professor, I didn't say a love, I said peace.
Peace, which is a legal document, a treaty signed that fix some relationship or official relationship between two regimes.
No, yes, I mean, basically there would be no acts of war, acts of terrorism committed by the Arabs against Israel, as did exist for many, many years prior to 1967.
A long timeline, yes, I do believe, as it happens with Egypt and Jordan, yes, and it will happen with Syria. It will happen also with the Palestinians. Definitely, with the Palestinians is much more complicated and difficult than with the other Arab countries.
Okay, let me ask Devin the same question. Go ahead, please.
Well, first of all, I have to disagree with the professor that he is trying to obfuscate the fact that Hamas openly calls for the destruction of Israel, just as he tried to ignore the Iranian threat, because that doesn't fit into his worldview, which is that the sole problem is a border problem, and therefore is available to a simplistic solution of adjusting the borders. I want to tell you, Professor, that you're undermining your credibility not only with me, but every one of the listeners who knows full well that Iran has called repeatedly for Israel to be wiped off the map, that Hamas has called repeatedly, its elected leadership, Khaled Mashal, has called repeatedly for Israel to be wiped off the map, that Iran just held a Holocaust conference. Iran just held a conference under the banner, A World Without Zionism. So your denials of the obvious are not making your case.
Okay, we're going to be coming up on a break. I don't want to get into another question before we get to the
conversation. Call in anytime at 602-508-0960. That's 602-508-0960. Outside of the Valley, call toll-free 888-960-9696. Now back to your host, Attorney William J. Wolf.
Welcome back to today's very interesting edition of Middle East Radio Forum. My name is William Wolf. The show every Sunday, noon to 1 o'clock. Adjust your time if you're listening elsewhere on my website, middleeastradioforum.org. Please spread the word about the show. I have two guests today, Professor Menachem Klein in Israel, and Devin, Sper, author of The Future of Israel, in studio. I have every line lit, so I'm going to ask everybody to please be very concise and brief with their questions. Let's go to David calling from Skokie first. Go ahead, you're on the air.
Hi, this is for Professor Klein. I just have a question. You referred to a possible peace treaty with Syria. I'd like to know how realistic you see that as being at this point in time, given Hafez al-Assad and his hostility, expressed hostility toward Israel in the past, and whether, since it is such a despotic regime, how can Israel really rely on a peace treaty lasting, given the potential instability in a regime such as Syria?
All right, thanks for the question. Go ahead, Professor.
Okay. I would like to remind you that Egypt is not a democratic state, neither Jordan, and still there is a very strong peace with each of them. It crosses very serious challenges and tests from the first war of Israel in Lebanon to the second war to intifadas. So we can and we must, in my view, we must sign a peace treaty with Syria, and the strong regime there that it's not democratic is not a problem. Not at all.
All right, what are you willing to give up, Professor, for a peace treaty? I mean, how about peace both ways, or does there have to be land component?
Four Israeli prime ministers, including Benjamin Netanyahu, agreed to full Israeli withdrawal from the Golan Heights. This was approved by all the American envoys involved in mediating between Israeli prime ministers and the Syrian regime.
All right, so do you advocate giving up all the Golan?
Yes, I do think that we have to give up all the Golan, and there is a very interesting proposal now that it's worth checking with the Syrian regime, with Assad Jr., that can settle down the few points remaining unsettled from the previous negotiation with Hafez al-Assad, the father.
Okay, let's go to Devin, please, a response.
Well, I agree with the professor that previous Israeli governments, for example, the Iraqi government, offered Syria the whole of the Golan Heights. In fact, Barak offered them a little bit of pre-1949 Israel. And the point, Professor, is that Syria rejected these offers. And what that should tell you, once again, is that this is not a border dispute, and that their objection to Israel is fundamentally on the principle to objection to a Jewish state, and attempting to change the modalities of the border is not going to assuage this fundamental objection. If we don't deal with the real issue, we're not going to solve it.
Okay, let's quickly go to Jeff calling from Avondale. I'm going to try to get all the calls on. Please be brief, Jeff.
Thank you. Professor, thank you for coming on the show. I never thought I'd hear someone who's a combination of Noam Chomsky and Neville Chamberlain. My question to you, sir, is how can you, as a Jew, support the most Nazified Islamo-fascist society which seeks to annihilate your brethren? I think you need to learn about Islam, sir. Thank you.
Go ahead, Professor Klein.
Please repeat. I could not hear quite well.
Yeah, he was saying, how can you support a Nazified regime like Hamas? He doesn't understand how you can have any relationships with a group that is dedicated to the destruction of Israel.
As I said, Hamas is changing, and I would like to challenge them. I would like to offer them a peace treaty along the Arab Peace Initiative that will be reinaugurated and relaunched within 2 weeks from now. I would like to challenge them, and I'm quite sure that they will accept it, or they will have a very strong debate, domestic debate, and that's not a problem. My interest is to establish peace relations with my neighbors, and by that secure my borders and move from abnormal situation of a garrison state, living on its word, to a more normal situation that many countries enjoyed.
Okay.
That's my strategic goal.
Okay,
I
let's
do not
quickly
think
go
that
to
is
Devin's.
something exceptional.
All right, let's quickly go to Devin before the next break. Quickly, please.
Yes, Professor, that's a worthy goal, and there are enemies with whom you can negotiate and enemies whom you must confront, and you need to learn the difference between the two.
Okay, we're going to the next break. We can return to this
Conversation, call in anytime at 602-508-0960. That's 602-508-0960. Outside of the Valley, call toll-free 888-960-9696. Now back to your host, Attorney William J. Wolf.
Welcome back to today's final segment of Middle East Radio Forum. I have Professor Menachem Klein on the telephone from Jerusalem and author Devin Sper in studio today. Please spread the word about the show. MiddleEastRadioForum.org is the key to listening anywhere in the world. Before I get to the callers, I want to ask another question on my own here. And Professor Klein, let me ask you, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Arab world remains one of the few remaining parts of the world without democratic government. Do you feel that Arab governments have used the issue of Israel to deflect criticism from their own people's lack of civil and human rights?
To some extent, yes, but I would like also to put your attention to the other way around argument. That, for example, take the opposition in Egypt. They argue against Sadat and Mubarak, both of them, that they can continue ruling in along non-democratic methods because they signed a peace agreement with Israel, and they do not listen to the people, and they are despotic and depend on the United States. So the peace agreement with Israel can be also a source for opposition inside the Arab world. But all in all, we can see that the Arab world is coming closer to Israel. There is an Arab peace initiative that all Arab states obliged to, and this was a great dream for us Israelis immediately after the Six-Day War. We did not have that then, we have it today.
Okay, Devin Sper, go ahead.
Well, I agree. I agree with the first part of what the professor said, that not only are the governments in the Arab world using Israel as a method of keeping people's minds off their own lack of freedom, but that the Islamic opposition is perhaps even worse. Nevertheless, that doesn't absolve the government of its responsibility for doing this. As to the Arab world getting closer to Israel, I'm sorry, Professor, but there is absolutely no evidence whatsoever to show that, and there is daily evidence to the contrary. Countries which are, there was a time when the Palestinians at least talked out of one side of their mouth about living together with Israel. That's no longer the case. There was a time when the government in Iran did not talk openly about wiping out Israel. That's no longer the case. In fact, Israel's show of weakness and peace process has brought about a situation where even in Europe, it's no longer taboo for politicians to talk about Israel as a state that will eventually disappear. So it's quite the opposite.
Okay, I do want to go to the callers. We've got a full board. Quickly, and just please ask a question briefly. Steve from Scottsdale, go ahead. You're on the air.
Yes, this is for Professor Klein. You've referred several times to the Egypt-Israel peace treaty. However, the record shows Egypt has not fulfilled the treaty. Over 50 agreements have not been fulfilled. You spoke about the opposition in Egypt. The Kafaya movement, that's anti-government, has dropped its demand for democracy and instead is focusing on a petition of 1 million signatures to tear up the treaty. President Mubarak has openly said that the treaty is nothing more than a piece of paper.
Steve, I need your question, please.
Okay, so my question is, do you really think peace with Syria or peace with any Arab country based on these kinds of peace treaties as was signed with Egypt, where Egypt is now claiming parts of the Negev and Eilat, do you really think such a piece of paper will work? Or as the Egyptian military rearms and supplies Hamas, when they are ready to take on Israel, the piece of paper will not protect Israel?
Okay, go ahead, Professor.
I live in the Middle East. I research the Middle East. I live in Israel. I beg your pardon, but I'm not aware of any Egyptian claim for the Negev and the Eilat. But perhaps I do not live in my time. I live back in 50 years back or 60 years back. But anyhow, I would, yes, I am in favor of peace treaty, formal peace that for the time, in long distance, it will lead to peaceful relations between the people. But for the first step should be peace treaty between regimes. And if you had asked me in 77, 79, do I dream that the peace treaty with Egypt will last 30 years, 40 years? I would say I buy it for 30 years. And I would like to remind you that 77, when Sadat came to Jerusalem, it was just 4 years after the attack of 73. So we have to bear it in our mind. And if, together with Sadat, Assad would have come to Israel, a peace treaty would have signed also with him. He refused to come. Sadat offered him. He woke up too late. But now there is a peace proposal coming from Syria, and also a peace can be signed with the Palestinians. I would like to remind you to suggest you to read MEMRI, MEMRI.org report from February 6, 2007 on new voices coming from Hamas. And MEMRI is not a leftist organization. It's a pure rightist, pro-Likud, pro-Netanyahu research center researching the Palestinian media. Go there, read, and follow what's going on inside Hamas.
Okay, very briefly, Devin, do you have a comment?
Yes, Professor. It may be possible to sign a peace treaty with the Palestinians. We've signed them in the past. The question is it worth anything? And the past history shows it's not. A peace treaty is only worth something if both sides really have goodwill. If the Palestinians are going to, again, simply pocket the land that we give them, use it as basis to lob missiles into Israeli cities, then the peace treaty isn't worth anything. As long as Hamas openly says that is what they're going to do, signing a peace treaty would be the height of naivety. Giving them more territory to attack us from is simply naive. Peace treaty in itself doesn't create peace. The will to peace creates peace. And the telling thing is the Palestinian education system, all of which is geared towards war, towards the destruction of Israel. If this is the case, then we clearly see where the face of Palestinian society is going.
Okay, thanks for your call, Steve. Let's quickly go to Bob calling from Glendale. Go ahead. Please be brief.
The professor made the comment that states do terrorism too. My question is he referring to Israel or America? If so, does he know the difference between collateral damage and deliberately targeting civilians? Okay,
good question. Go ahead, Professor.
I refer to states in general, and you can add to your list, you can add also Britain in Northern Ireland and many other countries. Now, in several operations, the planners and the operator forces can see that there are civilians in the area, that it is populated by civilians that has nothing to do with the armed people. Then it is quite clear in many cases, I can go into many details regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I cannot say, unfortunately, I'm very sad and sorry to say that, I cannot say that here we have white against black. That's not the case. I do not say that Hamas is white. I said earlier that Hamas is a terrorist organization, but unfortunately, I'm very sad to say that Israel is not doing enough in order to prevent hurting the innocent citizen Palestinians and implement collective punishment in purpose in order to punish the civilians. That's a problem of Israel, as it is also a problem of the American forces and also the British. We are not more cleaner than others. We are not worse than others. but we are not the chosen people in this aspect, unfortunately.
Okay, let's go to another caller. Hank calling from Phoenix. Go ahead, and please be brief.
Question for the professor. Two parts. Professor, in regards to the unity government now between the Palestinians and Hamas, obviously you've agreed that Hamas is known as a terrorist organization. Do you believe in any sense that this will form more difficulty and possibly the peace that you're stating that will occur between the unity government and Israel? Also, in regards to the Palestinians,
let him answer the first question first. Go ahead, Professor.
The national unity government, as far as we know from the platform, will let Fatah and Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas, to negotiate with Israel along the Arab peace plan. There is a consensus inside the Arab world that this is the cost, this is the proposal, the Arab League peace plan. And the gap between Fatah, Abu Mazen, Abbas organization, and Hamas, the gap is not that wide as it was 4, 5, 20 years ago. It's narrower. And both sides came closer and closer to agree on a unified platform. So we Israelis, we can negotiate with them and sign a treaty, and then each side should go to its own constituency for a referendum or for elections in order to approve by the citizens the treaty, the principles that were signed by the leaders. And
well,
then go ahead.
Professor Klein, aren't you assuming then that they're acting in good faith? And what historically tells you they're acting in good faith?
As the same, what tells me the good faith is the same good faith of Israel. Israel is not worse and neither better than the other side. Any argument that you raised against the Palestinians, I can raise against Israel.
All right, let's let Devin jump in here.
Principle,
all right, Devin, excuse me, Professor. Devin wants to jump in here. Go ahead, Devin.
Well, I have to disagree. The fact may be, as you said, Professor, that Israel isn't absolutely perfect. No place is absolutely perfect. But to jump from that and say that it's equivalent to Hamas, morally equivalent to Hamas, equivalent in its relation to enemy civilians to Hamas, is frankly speaking absurd.
Okay, and let's go to Hank's second question. Please be very brief, Hank.
Second question in regards to this potential peace agreement between Israel and the Palestinians. The Palestinians have been strong in regards to part of that peace agreement being the right of return. How do you meet that demand of the Palestinians?
All right, thanks very much, Hank. Go ahead, Professor.
Okay, I do think that the problem or the Palestinian problem began in 48, not in 67, and therefore we cannot escape dealing with the 48 file with the question of the Palestinian refugees and the establishment of the State of Israel. There is no way to escape this issue. And therefore, we cannot say there will be, in my view, no return at all.
All right, what are you suggesting, Professor? And please be brief.
Okay, I do suggest that as the Arab Peace Plan says, a just and agreed on solution to the refugee problem. Be it acknowledgement of the right of return in principle, but no return to the State of Israel, but only to the State of Palestine, it's one option.
Okay.
Another option, limited return to the State of Israel on a number that both sides agree. But we cannot ignore this issue and delete it from the table. It is a real problem.
Okay, Professor, let me follow up on that. Do you feel the Palestinians made a mistake in rejecting the 1948 UN partition plan? Actually, it was in 1947, I think.
Yes, they made a mistake, but the question historically, as any historian will ask, why they rejected, and could it be differently? In my view, it could not have been different, But if we say we want to look back, yes, they made a mistake.
Well, do you
but
feel they bear?
It's not only one mistake that they made.
All right. Do you feel that they bear responsibility for their mistake?
The responsibilities, they paid already the responsibility.
Okay, let's go to Devin.
From then up to date.
Okay,
yes,
Devin, you have a response?
Much.
Yes, I believe that when you attempt genocide against another people, which is what the Palestinians led by Haj Amin al-Husseini, an adjunct to Hitler, did in 1948, and you lose, you pay a price, and you should pay a price, and you don't get back what you started with.
Okay, let's quickly move on. Jack calling from Scottsdale. Again, please be brief. We're almost at the end of the show.
No problem.
Jack, you there? Okay, let's go to Matthew calling from Phoenix.
Hello?
Yes, is this Jack?
Yes, this is Jack.
Please be brief. Go ahead.
Yes, for Professor Klein, when in the entire course of history has any nation successfully negotiated a peace treaty with an unvanquished enemy committed to its destruction?
I said earlier, I do think that the Palestinians and the Arab states...
No, I don't think you're answering my question, sir. You don't understand the question. I'd like to know when ever has a nation negotiated a peace treaty with an unvanquished enemy that's committed to its destruction.
They do not call out to our destruction. They want to coexist with us, and this is our interest. That's it. It's very simple. Your question is based on wrong assumptions. That's not reality.
Okay, Devin, please jump in. Do you have any response to they're not calling for Israel's destruction?
Well, I don't need to say anything. I think the listeners have all heard enough declarations about Hamas and Ismail Haniyeh and Khaled Mashal and Ahmadinejad calling for Israel's destruction, conferences on the subject within the last few months, that they know very well whether the professor is speaking the truth or not.
Okay, unfortunately, we are at the end of the show. I really wish we had another hour. Professor Menachem Klein from Jerusalem, thank you very much for being a guest. I will definitely invite you again. Same thing for Devin Sper.